Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Galactic Armory. Today we've got something special for you. We've got Imperial Commander Cody, and here with me I have Jamie again. He did most of the work on this helmet, so he's going to help us walk through the whole process, do a bit of explaining about the painting, basically from the first step, dealing with a raw cast.
Yeah, hey folks. So we started off this process with one of our in-house made helmet casts, all from a raw cast all the way up to a finished product. And we're going to show you the process step by step to preparing the cast all the way up to painting and having a finished helmet ready for trooping or displaying.
Right, so we're starting with an animated Phase 2 cast. That's going to be our base of the helmet, right?
That's right, yeah. We produce these for all Clone Wars style, Bad Batch style projects. And we start off with this raw cast that needs the visor removed.
Yes, so when you rotocast a helmet like that, it kind of fills in the visor area. So the first thing that we want to do is cut that out so we can put in a nice reflective black visor.
Yeah, so the first step that we do is I like to put in guide holes first for that we will drill into and then use a Dremel cutting tool to remove these pieces. And that will just help stopping your hand slip.
Mm-hmm. And it's very important that you take this very carefully because when you're dealing with a Dremel, like a cutting wheel, if you slip, it can leave a big old gash across the opening of your visor.
It's a lot easier to take material away than it is to put it back on.
Yes, for sure. So those dots and drilling those holes are just going to help us control the Dremel cutting wheel a bit. You just basically, once you have the holes drilled out, you connect the dots slowly, and eventually the visor will fall right out.
And make sure that you have a mat down or some tarpaulin, or get a vacuum ready because it will be quite dusty. Mm-hmm. And make sure to wear proper PPE the whole time.
You definitely want some kind of respirator as well as eye protection in there.
100%.
I believe you're wearing a combination, like a full face respirator, so if any plastic bits get cut out or fly towards your face, you'll be protected. So, once you got the rough shape of the visor cut out, we've got to kind of refine the edge a little bit, because right now it's a little bit rough.
So I move on to using a Dremel sanding drum, which is just sandpaper on a circle that will allow me to smooth out those areas, which I gradually refine into shape, and then get into all those corners using files. And that will allow you to get a rough outline of the shape before you start smoothing it out with hand sanding with just some normal sandpaper.
Yeah, so we'll go from the rough edge to really refining that down to get a nice clean visor edge.
And altogether this should take no more than 30 minutes, so it's a lot quicker than working with a 3D print.
Yeah, for sure. So that's the nice part about the cast, is that it's very easy to work with a Dremel. You can't really do that with a 3D print just because the plastic will kind of warp and splinter and make a huge mess. So once we've got the visor trimmed out, we want to sand off some of the flashing around the seam lines of this mold.
So the seam lines are designed in a way that they are on the highest points, which is really easy to get to with sanding paper or with a file. And so what we do is take about 5 minutes just to get rid of any of that flashing, any of that little rough surface right at the corners, and it should clear up really quite quickly.
Mm-hmm. And unless your helmet mold is like a one-part mold, you're going to have these seam lines somewhere. And a lot of times they just kind of cut right through the middle of the helmet, but this way it's nice and hidden along the natural seam lines of the helmet.
So once that's clear, we want to just make sure that any places that you've gone too hard with sanding or with your file or with the dremeling process are cleared up using Bondo. Give that about an hour to dry, and then you're able to just sand that clear and finish with a primer.
Mm-hmm. So you started using a Rust-Oleum filler and sandable primer here. It's kind of a lighter gray.
Yeah, so when we looked at the references, we realized that the base color on Imperial Commander Cody's gray is a darker gray. So we ended up with a Rust-Oleum flat primer in the end.
Right. We were really struggling for some good references in lighting, but eventually I liked that darker gray color quite a bit. And Rust-Oleum flat primer is pretty easy to find. So once you've got that all around the helmet, you're going to be tracing out the details. Commander Cody's got a lot of them, so...
And they seem to be utterly random.
Yeah, like the shapes on the side of the helmets are like non-symmetrical or
completely hand-drawn, especially the one on top of the dome. So what I start to do is trace it out just with a pencil and an eraser. You should really take your time here. Do one side until you're really comfortable with that one side, and then you're able to use reference points with a ruler or a piece of fabric tape, and that will allow you to mirror the other side. Take your time. Draw it on with pencil first. You'll always be able to erase it. And then I like to use a very special tool of mine, which is a laser line, which will help you trace a straight line around a curved surface.
It's a really cool tool, I gotta say.
Yeah, because the issue is if you try to put a straight line of tape or a ruler on a curved surface, it will deviate. So using this laser line will allow you to trace a straight line on a curved surface, which is really important for clone troopers in particular.
So once you've got it all marked out and with pencil, what's next?
So we want to make sure that everything is taped up. We're going to be taping the areas that are remaining grey. It is the opposite way that most people do their tracing for these sort of markings. Because we want to keep that flat grey as the base for these markings, we're just going to place tape in these areas and then make sure it's nice and sealed for when we apply a flat white primer to everywhere else.
Is there a certain reason why you taped over the gray parts instead of taping off the white parts and then painting on the gray?
Because it allows you to see that everything is sitting and is situated exactly where it needs to be. Once you're satisfied that everything looks right, it looks symmetrical, and you're comfortable that it looks as you imagine it, you're good to go.
So, how long did that tape job take, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, a little bit longer than I thought it would, I have to admit. It took a while, but it was a lot easier than doing it the opposite way, where taping off everywhere else but the markings. What I also like to do is to over-tape and tape over areas that I'm not intending on keeping taped up, and then using a scalpel and just slowly refining and cutting away the tape, leaving exact lines exactly where you need to keep tape on.
That's a cool technique. I've never tried that.
I really recommend it if you've got a steady hand.
So now that this thing's ready for painting, we're going to take it into the paint tent. And what kind of paint are you using for the white?
So I like to use a Rust-Oleum flat white primer specifically rather than a matte top coat. The reason being is that these white primers, and any primer in general, will allow more paint to adhere to it better. And which is really important because I like to use a lot of airbrushing. So that means that you'll get a better finish when you start to refine it later with weathering and any other sort of interesting elements.
Do you remember how many coats of white this took?
I use around 3 every time. White is quite a translucent color compared to black or gray primer, and so you just need to keep spraying it until it is one coherent color, as you see here.
So once that white paint is dried, we get to do one of the more fun parts of this whole build, right?
Yes, so we finally get to peeling. And that's one of the most satisfying elements. It's our favorite element of these builds, which is you get to finally see that you were right and accurate with all of your markings, and the helmet in front of you starts to take shape.
It's really a huge payoff. Like, you get a great big dopamine rush when you actually start to see the correct colors on the helmet, and it starts to, take shape.
Best part of my job.
Mm-hmm. But there are some details to Commander Cody that are a little bit weird. So the area around the mouth, the center line, is actually kind of a darker color.
Yeah, so we like to use Archive X paint. Now, Archive X is specifically designed to be a color match to Star Wars color schemes and color palettes. So we chose them to be our main acrylic for hand painting and airbrushing. So I'm using their flat standard black here. They call it engine black. And I am going into all of those black areas that's such as the chin area, which Commander Cody is quite famous for. And I will decide to hand paint all of that in, as well as the earpieces.
Right, and these Archive X paints are really good, and the color supposedly quite match very well to Star Wars. The kit is pretty expensive, so you'd be mostly fine using a simple black or something else, but we wanted these paints because we wanted the best possible stuff to work with. So that's the base helmet of Commander Cody, looking pretty good, right?
Yeah, he looks like Grunt Imperial Cody,
Yeah,
which means he's missing something.
he is missing quite a few details. Commander Cody has one of the most tricked out helmets in the Clone Wars. So let's talk a little bit about those accessories. Okay, so here you've got the FDM 3D prints for like the visor, the helmet straps, like the antenna, and the radio on the side of his head.
And don't forget his GoPro.
That's right, his little optic. Those are all FDM prints, and we're going to be smoothing them out here with some SLA resin.
Yes, that's right. So using proper precautions, we like to put on gloves, proper respirators, and then we will use a disposable chip brush and just coat these pieces with a nice light layer of SLA resin. That's UV photoreactive resin. And we'll use a UV floodlight just to cure it instantly and get into any of those deep recesses that commonly are a result of FDM printing.
Mm-hmm. And the goal here is to basically just smooth out those 3D printer lines. You got to skip the whole process of this for the base helmet because it was a cast, but these accessories are going to be FDM printed. We also offer these prints along with the cast as well.
So once they're coated, I like to make sure that everything is cleaned off from excess resin with some IPA solution. That way they'll be free to handle with your bare hands. And at that point, I like to make sure that I hand sand everything with some 80 grit just to get the highest peaks down, any drips, and just it gives you an idea about how much work needs to be done. So at this point, I like to make sure that I coat everything with a filler primer by Rust-Oleum, which will allow you to see any gaps, any distinct print lines, which you are able to then tackle with the classic Bondo.
Mm-hmm. And that filler does help fill in some of the lines, but we're going to be using Bondo to fill in some of the more major ones.
And at this point, you can see compared to the standard filler primer Bondo sanding method, we're already quite far along in the sanding process by using this resin. When it comes to recessed pieces with details, you will still want to get Bondo on it, but you don't want to risk losing that detail. What I like to use are toothpicks to get into these recessed areas, clear out that Bondo, which allows you to keep the areas around it still nice and smooth and ready for sanding.
You got to do that while the Bondo's still wet. You don't want to let it harden, otherwise you're going to have to sand a lot, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to remove all that.
And you'll very likely still lose that detail.
Mm-hmm.
So here everything is coated with Bondo. I'm satisfied with those areas that don't currently have Bondo on it are good enough, ready to go.
Okay. So now we've got to do a bit of sanding. I'm going to be using the mouse sander here. What kind of grit sandpaper on there do you have?
So I like to use about 120 at this point, just gradually going up to about 220 in the next pass. As you can see, it makes short work of these flat areas and will clear out any of those high points and again allow you to see what gaps there are, what issues you have in the print itself.
So I love using the mouse for a lot of large flat surfaces. It covers that in no time. But this is something that you showed me actually using these sanding sticks.
So that's the issue with a lot of Greeblies, that they often do not have a lot of flat surfaces and there's a lot of detail pieces. So I have these sanding sticks, which are not sticks at all. They're actually sponge with standard grit sandpaper on each side. Now these allow you to get into really, really tight corners. It allows you to push down into recessed areas because of the sponge, and it can clear out areas that your mouse sander or even your hands can't usually reach.
I think it would save your fingers a lot of headache and finger ache.
This is just 180 grit sanding stick, and they go a little goes a long way, and it goes all the way up to even 600 grit.
Yeah, and these are pretty cheap too, as I remember.
Extremely cheap. This pack of I think 50 different sanding sticks were only about $6.
So now, since you got the helmets to a good smoothness, we're going to take them off for the finishing round of smoothing.
Yeah, so I like to refine everything to make sure it looks like armor. So what I like to use through all of this process is just 800 grit wet sanding paper. So as you see here, it takes a little bit of water, a little bit of sandpaper, and I like to just do a rough sand over every surface. And you'll see what previously looked perfect can actually start to sand away nearly invisible lines, and you'll get perfect armor after just a couple passes.
I gotta say, wet sanding is kind of brings the print to the next level. An analogy I like to use is that when you're done hand sanding everything before wet sanding, it's got kind of a paper texture to it. It's smooth, but it's still a little bit rough. After this wet sanding, it is almost glass smooth.
I think I even show here that you can actually see quite a lot of reflections just showing in it.
Wet sanding is the perfect way to finish off sanding these FDM parts.
And so once that's done, it's ready for a final coat and ready to paint up for the helmet itself.
You're going to do one last round of the Rust-Oleum filler and sandable then?
I just like to make sure that any imperfections are covered, and Rust-Oleum filler primer is very good as a paint primer as well, so this should be ready for its final coats of paint.
Awesome.
Speaking of final coats of paint, we have one Greebly that's slightly different to the rest. All the other Greeblies will be grey on Imperial Commander Cody, but the mouthpiece is white, so just to make sure, I will cover this with a flat white primer, like everything else, and that should be ready for final paint with the rest of the Greeblies.
Okay, now that we've got everything sanded and smoothed out, we're ready to get to some painting, right?
Yeah, so by Archive X, we like to use a dark reefer grey as the base coat. As you see on this Imperial Commander Cody, it is just a lot of various grey colours. So the two main colours we use, again, are dark reefer grey and light reefer grey. So as you see here, we're base coating all of the Greeblies in a dark reefer grey, and then we'll approach all the detail areas with a light reefer grey. Now, the detail areas in particular are the middle of the mohawk, the middle of each one of the helmet bands, a detail area on the flashlight, and then, of course, the design on his visor.
That design's really intricate. That must have been even more fun to tape.
It took a while and a little bit of refining. I like to make sure to continue to use a pencil and an eraser and just take my time with it, refining as I go. Remember, if it doesn't look right once you painted it the first time, you can go back and refine it, hand paint, re-mark items, and get it to where you want. It doesn't need to be right the first time.
Right. And you're using an airbrush here, so drying times are kind of shortened
as well when I make sure to use a hairdryer.
Mm-hmm. So if you're using something like a rattle can, make sure and wait the appropriate amount of time between coats and between colors, just so you don't have any kind of bleeding or orange peeling effect.
Or marks from the tape that you're using.
Right.
So I like to make sure that everything is done in the Greeblies before I move on to the weathering process. So to finish up the Greeblies, we use engine black and just do a coat over the lens to get that lens effect, and then to add a glass effect, we finish it with some Citadel hard coat, which creates a nice glossy finish.
Yeah, it makes it look really, really reflective and glass-like.
And so a couple coats of that is all you need.
So the peeling is one of our favorite parts of the helmet building process, but for me, weathering is a close second.
For me, it's probably number one, because at this point, you get to really make this helmet go from a prop to something that actually looks real and, in world.
Give it a lot of character and make it look a lot more believable as a prop and as a helmet.
So you want to make sure it looks like it's telling a story. For example, we realize that this is a new helmet for Commander Cody.
Mm-hmm. We're still in the early days of the Imperial reign, so that helmet of his would be probably pretty new.
Yeah, so we didn't want to go too heavy with the black wash. We used a really watery mix and made sure to just do light coats and gradually build it up until it's not just one uniform color that has a little bit of texture to it, but it's not dirty by any means.
After that, you're going to be hitting it with an airbrush with that engine black.
Yeah, so I like to get into all those recesses. It just provides depth. I don't want to go too dirty in particular, but you see, just to get into those crevices that, he might have fought one or two battles, and a little bit of carbon can get into those deepest parts.
And that's where it would most likely stay, too, is you can do a quick brush over with the helmet, be it simple cleaning or just wearing around, and those recessed areas are going to keep that dirt because, they're the least likely to get brushed off.
Yeah, so the deepest areas will gather dust, and the highest areas will always get scuffed. That's the idea.
Speaking of scuff marks, he's got some on his face that I asked you to accentuate. So how do you do that?
So I made sure to just first guide the area with an airbrush just to refine that shape. I gradually go over it with an eraser and just shape it, because it's very easy to get rid of airbrush paint with an eraser before you provide a top coat.
So you just erase the paint away, basically.
You shape it into what you want. Just you add paint to then take it away where it needs to go. And you can always repeat that again and again until you're satisfied.
It's very cool. It gave it some nice crisp lines. And you're going to be doing similar things around the greeblies, doing a little bit of that engine black in the airbrush and recessed areas.
Yeah, and we just want to make sure that everything looks like it's been used just a bit. And we want to also accentuate the animated element of it by adding a little bit of a gradient into the corners.
Kind of playing into that same animated look, you're going to be doing a bit of scuffing, right?
Yeah, I'm going to hit the highest points with this light reefer gray. And that will just make sure it will look a little bit more animated, but also a little bit more worn. Just a little bit of weathering, and you want to just make sure that it's not streaking, and you're just dry brushing into those corners and onto those highest points.
And what's that little square thing? I think a lot of people would be interested to know what that is.
So that is a dry brushing palette. It is just a series of different textures on a plate that when you're about to dry brush, you dry brush onto that first, and it'll give you a better idea of what the final result will look like before you apply it to what you want the dry brush to be on.
Yeah, I think it looks really great. The devil really is in the details, and this amount of detail, it adds a lot to the finished and the overall look of the helmet. Got some last minute touching up to do around that mouth detail. That's just got kind of an elongated triangle on it.
Yep, and that just uses the dark reefer gray to bring everything in together, and that will finish off all the greeblies.
So with all those accessories weathered and the base helmet weathered, we are ready to put this thing together. How are we going to do that?
So I like to just use some CA glue or super glue. I want to get it into place first, do a dry fit first, and then once everything is as you like it, it's fitting well, you know where it's going to go, then you apply the CA glue, get it into place, and then I like to hit everything with a little bit of CA glue activator, which will instantly harden the glue and will actually provide a stronger bond than if you let it dry normally. So once those pieces are all in place, you just want to do one last coat of weathering into those recesses just to make sure that everything looks like it's been in one piece this whole time and it got all of that dirt in the same spots that the normal recesses did.
Right. You want to be careful about weathering parts of the helmet at different stages. At the end, you want them all to blend together pretty seamlessly. So that's kind of the goal here, is to make sure that everything is uniform and looks believable and looks like it's all one singular unit.
And once that's done and you're satisfied with everything, you can hit it with a top coat of matte clear coat.
Mm-hmm. We definitely want to protect this paint job. It is looking exquisite. There's one last thing we need to do to the helmet, I believe, and that needs a black visor.
Yeah, so we use a Hobart face shield. We need to get the exact measurements for Cody, so I use a piece of paper and place it inside the helmet on the inside of the visor and trace an outline using a pencil, take that out, cut that out, and use that as a template for cutting out the Hobart face visor using a little bit of overlap just to make sure that there are no gaps showing.
You want to expand out your traced marking a little bit. And then you're going to be using something that I am new to, some of these visor clips.
Yeah, so these are just friction clips that allow you to put in a visor temporarily and can take it out later. It's just little plastic pieces that provide a hold onto the visor. What they do is you just, with a little bit of hot glue, you put a couple of them into the visor, put them in place, slot the visor in, and then you can encapsulate the visor with a few more until it's held exactly as you need it. This is very good when the helmet that you're working with doesn't have the visor holding lines.
Right, the little ridge line.
Yeah, which most casts these days will not be able to provide that. So I, from my experience, have used these visor clips for years now, and I swear by them.
Yeah, they work surprisingly well. I wasn't sure hot glue would be able to hold them in, but how many did you use for this visor?
This visor only needed 4, one on either side of the T, and then 2 at the very bottom to hold it into place. That will also allow you to slot it in and out if you need to clean it. And then it's not a permanent bond, so you can actually peel off those visor clips if you need to replace them completely.
That is a nice point as well. Sometimes that visor gets scratched or dirty and you need to take it out and clean it or replace it, and that's really nice that you can pull it back out. Well, Jamie, I think we're all done. We've got a beautiful looking Imperial Commander Cody helmet here. I gotta say, you really knocked it out of the park on this one.
Yeah, thank you. We're really happy with how this came out, and it was fantastic to see Commander Cody again in the recent Season 2 of Bad Batch.
It really was. I hope we get to see more of him. I don't think his story is quite over yet.
And remember, if you want to make this yourself, our casts for animated Phase 2 clones are available on our store at Galactic Armory. And if you want to make Commander Cody in particular, we now also sell both files and DIY kits for all of his Greeblies.
Yeah, that's right. You can find links for those in the description. Well, Jamie, is there anything else you want to talk about before we head out?
No, I think this is a fantastic build. I'm very happy with how it came out. I'd recommend checking out Archive X and their paints for this color scheme. And feel free to message us if you have any questions on these builds. And we're looking forward to showing you more in the future.
Well, guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this build series video on Imperial Commander Cody. I hope you learned something, and I hope you're feeling motivated to take on a project like this yourself. As always, thank you for watching, and we're looking forward to seeing you again in the next video.